things started. Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us for this 5th episode of the Clements Bookworm. Let's see. If you haven't had a chance yet to vote in our poll, we're curious how you organize your photographs. And by the way, you can select more than one of those. I thought there is probably the possibility that many of us are using more than one of those techniques for organizing your photos. I am Angela Unk. I'm Director of Development at the Clements Library. And just so you know, this meeting is being recorded today online, and later we will send you an email with a copy of the recording and any of the resources that are shared in today's discussion. Just a quick tutorial. I want you to take note of a couple of things. I see that people are already saying hello in chat, so thank you so much. Please chime in and continue the discussion there. If you select all panelists and attendees, everyone will be able to see your comments, and the conversation goes by very quickly. So because of that, I would like to encourage you that if you have questions, that you use the Q&A section instead. There you can ask your questions. If you see a question that you were going to ask that somebody else has already asked, you can upvote the question and we can answer online, or we can type the answers and then they're posted right there with the question. My colleagues Ann Bennington-Helber and Tracy Palovich will be monitoring the chat and helping to provide some answers and some links to resources along the way. This program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library. We're located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library enables the discovery, learning, and teaching of American history through the collection, conservation, and availability of primary sources on paper. So we hope that once we're back up and running, if you haven't yet, that you come to visit us, and we'll look forward to seeing you. Today's panelists are going to be talking about identity in photography. So before we get to our first panelist today, I'm going to stop our poll and see where we landed. Share the results. On the computer, thumb drive, or in cloud storage was the overwhelming winner of the way that we're keeping and organizing our photos these days. So 73% of the respondents said that. But a lot of us are still doing an album or a scrapbook or putting those photos in a box. I'm curious what the other is. So if you have, if anybody has interesting ways, maybe you can share it in the chat so we can all learn from your experience. So, all right, let me just close that and introduce our first panelist. All right. Gabe Konrad is joining us. He is the owner of Bay Leaf Used and Rare Books. Gabe, tell us a little bit about your selection today.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk about the book Family Art by Philip Pacey. It's an older book, published 30 years ago, and at the time Pacey was an arts librarian and historian. When I first came across this book, the idea of family art was intriguing to me, and the book's premise that every family creates its own visual traditions, especially the author says, those that embody the family's understanding and love of one another. He does, in the course of the book, go on to connect art in the home to a wider view of art and understanding within the community. But mostly he sticks to art within the home, and gives several examples of what can contribute to a family's visual traditions. Some of these include early portraiture. These would be paintings of individuals or families, and usually for the well-to-do. Photographs. It could be studio and later snapshots, either on the wall or in albums. Scrapbooks. Crafts like homemade furniture, painted furniture, quilts, handmade dollhouses. He discusses children's art, of course, Christmas and other holiday decorations, gardens, even things seemingly as mundane as displays on a mantelpiece or flower arrangements, and hair work. He just talks about hair work can simply be a lock of your baby's hair in a scrapbook, or more intricate examples of woven hair used as memorials. I think most of us have seen those, are often framed. The hair can be woven together with ribbons or dried flowers and displayed with snippets of poetry, things like that. Pacey does spend quite a bit of time talking about memorial photographs. And he says, with the introduction of photography, photographers went out of their way to promote it as an unprecedented means of preserving human likenesses beyond the grave. Photographers' sales pitch was, save your money and have portraits taken of your family so you can remember them when they're gone. There's certainly some truth to that. And as a result, you'll often see family portraits where one family member is holding a picture of a deceased loved one in the shot. And then it's also resulted in post-mortem photographs. These type of photos are pretty shocking to us now, very jarring when you look at them, but at the time I think it was kind of a better late than never situation. In fact, the author goes to tell a story about an older gentleman whose wife passed away. And they were a poor family. He had nothing, no pictures, no portraits or anything of her. So he scraped together enough money to go to a portrait photographer and asked him to take a set of clothes. He had her shawl, bonnet, gown, shoes, and some oranges, because she really loved oranges, and asked him to arrange them nicely and take a portrait, which he did. And he just felt that this was enough to bring her back into his memory, because it is all that he had left of her. So all of these different visual traditions, all of these facets come together, as the author says: family photos, pictures on the wall, familiar furniture, become images and objects together that form a total environment. Single created work, never complete, which the family extends into the future and with which it embraces its past. I think this is a beautiful sentiment about an aspect of home life that isn't usually discussed. And while this is a book about the history of these types of objects and how they help form a home, it's also about art and the foundation of art, and artistic nurturing, because, again, as the author says, art in the home is dependent on mutual support, appreciation, and understanding. However, what really attracted me to this book was its discussion on photography, photo albums, and scrapbooks and their place in the family. Photo albums and scrapbooks share a common heritage. Precursors were handwritten commonplace books, and connoisseur albums, where Collectors would gather prints or poetry or similar items and place them in blank books or often repurposed books. Um, the first commercially sold albums came out in the 1850s. And these were for the CDVs and cabinet cards. These were the type of albums where you would slip the card back photograph into a slot and it would hold it tight in place. No adhesives were used, which was nice. Um, by the 1880s and certainly 1888, when Kodak released its first affordable camera, um, photo albums became much more common. And by the end of the century, and with the release of the $1 Kodak Brownie camera in 1900, photo albums were a full-blown pastime. If we can show that, there we go. I love this photo on the right here. That's from the Art of the American snapshot from the National Gallery of Art. Pacey says, every photograph is a peephole into the life of the past. Every home is a living museum. It is filled with pictures and things which in one way or another have a place in the life of the family and tell us something about it. I certainly feel this photo really depicts the idea of a living museum here. Quote another book, Photographic Memory, The Album in the Age of Photography by Verna Curtis. Curtis says, from the earliest days, albums have been made for the purpose of preserving impressions and launching memories. They commemorate events and activities, recognize accomplishments, aid memory, contribute to family lore, and test pictorial ideas. I think the idea of launching memories is key. Curtis goes on to say that looking at albums redoubles the storytelling impulse that photographs naturally trigger. I can imagine, and most of us have done this, parents or grandparents sitting with the children, going through a photo album, telling the story of each photo, each family member, an event. And I've often wondered, is this one of the reasons so many albums have no captions? Or even ownership marks. These albums, I think, were often treated as picture books, and only the reader really knew the story. Unfortunately, after a generation or two, these stories are often forgotten, and what remains are anonymous pictures. At that point, it's up to usually curious family members, genealogists, special collections librarians, even sometimes booksellers, to track the clues and figure out who these people were and learn something about them. Unfortunately, the subjects of individual photographs, especially loose snapshots, often have no chance of being identified. Once the photograph is removed from the family, it's moved out of context. This happens, through estate sales, garage sales, donations, auctions. eBay is awash with photo albums, family photo albums, many of them anonymous. The author does briefly discuss what he terms the lifting up of a found object. He talks about if you are, say, on a family hike in the mountains and you find an interesting rock, you take it out of its natural context, take it home, set it on your mantelpiece with some other photographs and souvenirs. It's got new meaning and significance there. It's another memory trigger of this great hike you had with your family. This also works with photographs, especially anonymous photographs. They're disconnected from their family for whatever reason. And they can be taken and placed in another context, giving it new meaning and significance. And this often happens through art. And that's all I've got.
All right. Thank you so much, Gabe. I was curious because we got talking about it beforehand about some of the older photos have. it sounds like you do some collecting of your own. Can you tell us a little bit about that collection?
Sure. I collect individual snapshots that we find often, antique stores and garage sales and other places. Um, I collect by subject because there's so many great photos and you can't buy them all. So I have collections of photographs of things like dogs, which there are tons of pictures of dogs out there, and cats, which there are not so many. Um, and photos of people with bicycles, people reading or with books, uh, and a few other subjects. Photo album or photo booth photos, and my wife collects Halloween snapshots, usually older, black and white and older Halloween pics. Um, I store them in vintage albums, trying to use archival corner mounts and whatnot. And um, here is this type of thing. Here's a page of dogs.
Oh, nice. Love it.
Uh, if there's, and then I'll write captions below if there's anything written on the back of the photo, which unfortunately most of the time there isn't.
Mhm.
Or it's, me and the dog, something something not very
So,
helpful when you're trying to identify it.
right, exactly. And so you've touched on this a little bit, and we saw that a lot of people are keeping their photos on their cell phone or on their computer. So do you think that we'll see the documentation of family history through photo albums declining?
Yeah, I think we will. That I think the more people, it's so easy and it's so handy to have pictures on your phone and to post them online. But a lot of times, I think once, especially online, people see a photo and they like it and they move on, and there's just millions of other photos online. It's hard to kind of go back and kind of trace your family through that medium. And I think that a lot of those images will eventually just be lost to time. Um, this book, Family Art, by Pacey, I mentioned it's an older book. It was published in 1989. It could be really interesting to read, kind of a modern take on the subject that includes the influence of the camera phone. And I think this time where we're kind of presenting a much more public version of our private lives, where photos are a little more staged and presented online. Um, and I think that traditionally snapshots, as I mentioned, help record an experience for posterity. Um, but now it seems more and more like people are, the experience comes secondary to the recording of the experience so they can present it on Instagram or through their Facebook personality.
Right, right. Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see what's written about that and how it's studied as well. So I'm sure we'll have some more questions for you at the end of the program. So if anyone has more questions, please keep putting them in the Q&A and we'll have some more time for those at the end. But for now, thank you for your comments, Gabe.
Thank you.
And unmute Samantha and welcome her to the program. So next we have Samantha Hill, who is the Joyce Bonk Fellow in Digitization at the Clements Library and a University of Michigan graduate student in the School of Information. And in addition, she is also the creator of the Kinship Project, which records personal experiences through storytelling, community engagement, and the photographic image. So today she's talking about Pictures in Progress. Samantha, when did you first read this book?
So I first read this book a few years ago. It was written by Basically, it's edited by Maurice O. Wallace and Sean Michelle Smith. And Sean Michelle Smith was my advisor when I went to grad school at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And so the interesting thing about having Sean as my advisor is that we would have conversations about photography and also about the meaning behind the photograph, as well as the experience of the photograph. And so I like to read books written by other art historians and scholars to like evaluate and to learn more about how do we as the public, like, you know, interact with photography. What does it mean within history? How is it represented? How can we represent photography within our own work and even within our own lives? So basically with the book Pictures in Progress, it's the early photography and making of African American identity. Again, it's edited by Maurice O. Wallace and Sean Michelle Smith. What's interesting about this book is it's a collection of essays. So you can read it in a couple of different types of ways. You can read it from cover to cover, and you can get this continuous, basically narrative about how Frederick Douglass's lectures stimulated this really great conversation about photography and its use, and then how other photographers as well as activists use photography in order to either express their own lives or to express their political views. And so I would like to discuss like two articles that I think are really interesting. So the first one is Rightly Viewed, the Theorizations of Self in Frederick Douglass's Lectures and Pictures on Pictures. It was written by Ginger Hill. And basically she discusses how basically Frederick Douglass gave multiple lectures between 1859 to 1865 about the technological advances of photography, which allowed for the sharing of human experiences. So his lectures, Life in Pictures, Age of Pictures, and Pictures in Progress discuss how photography, as stated by Ginger Hill, is defined as human integrity through this innovative medium. Frederick Douglass, he basically believed that photography had a way, or had the, it had a way to elevate people from one set of circumstances into create a new set of circumstances for themselves. So Frederick Douglass was an active participant of posing for various photographers. And he did that because he was interested in displaying his self as a self-made man and to really elevate his image of how people would perceive him through having all these different photographs. Now, one thing you should understand is that during this time, there was also a lot of caricatures that were created that also were like the best representation of African Americans. Like a lot of stereotypes were in these images. So for him to actually take a photograph or to pose for a photograph allowed people to see him as a dignified, intelligent, like man who's also a contributor to society. And therefore it kind of counteracts those other caricatures and really promotes this idea of self. Another thing that I like to discuss is how when you pose for a photograph, the person has the opportunity to construct their own image with photography. And this gives the power to the individual to create the image of themselves that they wish to present to the world instead of accepting the categories or judgments that the world projects on them. We all like fall into those ideas of like what society expects of us, but then also we have this option to create like this new view of the world, and we do it all the time. If you think about Instagram and Facebook, just like Gabe said, it's just like that is like those theories and the way that we like activate like these online and social media sites is the same way and the same method that Frederick Douglass was using with photography. So to talk again about the idea of the self-made man, so basically he was really about like, you know, people having like working hard and establishing self-worth as well as worth within their community, and how photography really captures that. So it's really interesting that when you think about how we would like to be remembered and how much control we have on that, is also about like the decisions that we make when we pose in front of the photograph. Everything from the clothes that we're wearing, the expression on our face, anything we're holding, anything we're interacting with at the time, also translates into that photograph. It can be a candid snapshot that really represents that moment in time, or it can be quite staged. There are quite a few photographs in my collection, especially from the 40s and 50s and 60s, where 'cause I collect photographs of African-American families, and I've found some really wonderful examples of how they've interjected humor into their snapshots by staging. And so it's like they're not only are they having fun with their family, but they're also like, you know, they're creating a story. And sometimes I'm curious to know, well, what was the decisions that they made, like, you know, to make this shot? And so it's kind of interesting that, like, you know, people are planning these narratives, you know, within the photograph, as well as just taking random snapshots and capturing that special moment. That leads me to talk about Cheryl Finley's article, which is called No More Auction Block for Me. And it really, this article's about the discovery of a tintype family album for Cheryl Finley, and also the description of the books she found and the photographs inside it. Now, one thing I should talk about this is, like, she has found a small, basically, like, through an auction, she had an opportunity to, like, page through this small tintype photo album of an African-American family. And she describes the book itself as this small, intimate book that's almost like a small Bible that you would carry along with you. It's approximately, I would say, like 4 inches by 5 inches. It fits very comfortably on the palm of the hand. It has a latch on the side. So it kind of is almost like when you open the book, it's like opening the door almost to a church, if you want to keep the spirituality, like, idea going through. And
Samantha, I recall that you have a similar photo album that you've collected. Do you have it with you? Can you show it to us?
oh, sure, I do. Actually, just to kind of give you guys an idea, let me see, let me pull it back a little bit so you can see the size, you know, and thickness. The whole thing is gilded in gold on the edges. And here's the latch. This is what's really interesting. It's like the latch looks like a belt. And then you can open it up, and inside are these basically tintypes. And what's interesting about paging through a book like this is that the photographs are so small, but they have a lot of clear detail. And you really do connect with the people inside it as you really look at it. First, like, thing you should think about is, well, not think about, well, the first thing I think about when I look at this is how old the photograph actually is, and how clear, like, and how it's preserved through time. And another thing I consider is, what are they wearing? How are they posing? This photo that's projected onto the screen right now, this is from the photographic album that Cheryl Finley found. And she calls it, like, woman with an earring. And if you look at her, she's standing there and she has a quite regal pose. Her shoulders are back, her head is up. She's also has a very casual pose too, because you can see how she's leaning on the fence post that's, like, posed in the photographer's studio. But she's wearing this very interesting hat that has this, like, asymmetrical, like, balance to it. And then also you see, like, the decoration that's around it. But then there's this one single hoop earring that I found really intriguing. Like, right now, like, if someone was to walk down the street with a hat like this and a single hoop earring, we're like, oh, she is so cool. She is, like, the top of fashion. But here is, like, you know, she's really expressing herself through the image. Like, you know, she's really creating, like, you know, her own personality is projected through it. She has this nice, like, subtle smile. her eyes have this softness to them. She's like a kind of person you really want to get to know. And then while looking at it, holding this really small book. So that's the key too. It's like this book is so small, and when you look at it and you hold it, you really connect to it. And you're like, who is this person? You know? Whoop,
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, I know you and I talked a lot about the stories contained within these photo albums and within the photos. And you mentioned what a great teaching resource you think these are. And I'd love to have you talk a little bit more about that as well.
oh yes, absolutely. So basically, the great thing about these photo albums is that they're a great teaching tool, especially if you want students to connect to history, and also to really think about identity, not only the identity of the people in the photographs, but then also their own identity. And what was really amazing is that here at the Clements, a project like that actually happened. There was a collaboration between Clayton Lewis, who is like curator of graphics, and professor here at University of Michigan, Dr. Martha Jones, and the both of them like collaborated together to have her students learn about and study Arabella Chapman photo album, which is right here. You see projected on the screen. So basically, you see a photograph of Arabella Chapman, and then on the other side, you see the first, like the inner cover of the book, where there's a transcription, basically, that this was for Annabella Chapman and was given to by R.H. Baum. And the interesting thing is that if you think about these tintype albums, they do become sort of storybooks. There's really no place to put a caption. So it's really just to collect the photograph of the people that you care about and that you find are important to your life. So in this photo album in particular, you have Arabella Chapman's family. Also, you have photographs of her friends. And then there's even a picture of Abraham Lincoln. So it shows the significance that, you know, she would put a picture of the president inside of her photo album about his significance in her life. Here, if you look at this one, this is a picture of Thomas, Charles, Williams, and John Jones. And what's really great about this photograph is look at the way that they're posed together. Like, you know, this is a staged photograph. But if I want you to look down to the man on the, like, well, he's on my left. He's like wearing the white pants. Look how his legs are crossed. He's leaning back into his relatives. His head is up and he has this smile, and he also has this swagger as he's looking into the camera. And one thing I think is really beautiful and touching is that he's also, you see the hand of his relative on his shoulder. So it really shows like him leaning back and the other person like connecting forward, that sense of kinship and camaraderie that is just really beautiful in these photographs. So it's just, I think that there's like something very powerful about that. Basically, with my job at the Clements, I have the opportunity to digitize materials for research. And the first collection I worked on was the Tinter collection of basically daguerreotypes and embryotypes. And that was an amazing experience to look at all of those photographs and really connect to the people in them. Mm-hmm. It's like they look directly into the camera. Some of them are holding things. Like one woman was holding a picture of herself in a similar, so she posed in a very similar pose and she held a picture of herself. So it kind of had this meta thing going on where it's like two mirrors being reflected against each other, and it just kept going and going. And it was like a daguerreotype. So the daguerreotypes are reflective, kind of like mirrors when you look at them. So then if you imagine her looking at her own picture in a daguerreotype with another picture and it keeps going on and on, that's just like super cool, okay?
It is. It's very cool. Um, and it's so great to have you on board digitizing these different collections.
Oh yes, it's like I find it like it's really for me like I one of my things I like to do is research photography, and this has been a really great learning experience for me to engage with these photographs. And when I like think about the book Pictures in Progress, I really think about that. It's not just about identity with African Americans, but it's also how like photography really is a strong tool to define oneself and how one interacts with it. There's this with this book, they're really just dealing with the African American experience, and also different topics within that. So it talks about politics, it does talk about race, it also talks about how photographers use photography to talk about themselves, the people they interact with, and other political leaders. So it's a really interesting read. And also just if you have an opportunity to check out the 10 types that are in the collection at the Clements, I highly recommend paging through that, because I was talking with Clayton about his experience. Well, we were messaging about his experience working on the Arabella Chapman project with Dr. Jones. And he said this thing that was extremely important and really insightful, that like here at the University of Michigan, many students are business students or technology students. And so the only chance they have, like the humanities are not necessarily like the focus. But these students who are interacting with this photo album were not humanities students, but they really took a deep dive to explore this album and research who the people are and have conversations about the people in these photographs and the importance in that. And they even like participated in creating photographs of them for posing for photographs as a part of the project, so they can kind of understand the 10 type process. So if you think about that, not just the experience that we have when we look at photographs and photography, but the experiences you can give to students.
Right.
That is just precious. And so,
Yes. Thank you so much, Samantha. We have a lot of questions. I've been keeping my eye on them, but several of them seem like questions that would be great for the whole panel to discuss together. So keep putting them in the Q&A, but I do want to thank Samantha for the time being and introduce our next speaker so that we don't run out of time. So thank you, Samantha. And we'll unmute Les and get started. So Les, thank you so much for being with us today. Les is a volunteer at the Clements Library in the graphics division, and he is going to discuss how working on the Tyler Montgomery Scott family album led him to discover the book, The Beneficiary, Fortune, Misfortune, and the Story of My Father by Janie Scott. Welcome, Les. So tell us a little bit more about your work on this album.
Sure. Well, this is a pretty large album, about 275 photographs plus some other items, and it traces the various generations of a very wealthy suburban Philadelphia family, excuse me, who live on an 800-acre estate outside of downtown Philadelphia. The album was compiled in the late 1930s by the then patriarch of the family, the woman shown on the left there, though she was much older by the time this was put together. Her name is Charlotte Hope Binney Tyler Montgomery. The multiple names, you know, the names of the family change as the daughters marry into new families. But she put the book together using photographs going all the way back to 1860, which is pretty unusual. And there are some unique things in the album. There are a number of photographs of Theodore Roosevelt and his family. apparently one of the members of the family had a close relationship with the Roosevelts and visited the White House and went on some foreign trips with them and so forth. There's also a series of photographs of the interior of a townhouse that in downtown Philadelphia that the family lived in before they moved to this big estate in suburban Philadelphia. And that's interesting because it just shows what furnishings and decorating styles were like in 1896. And that's something you don't run across all that often. So I worked on this for a couple of months and cataloging it. And not long after that, I discovered this new book that had just come out by a contemporary member of this family, a woman named Janie Scott. She's actually the great-granddaughter of the woman who put the album together in the late 1930s. And she's a former New York Times reporter. The book is called The Beneficiary. It's a memoir of the family, and mainly focuses on her father, who figures in the album as a young child because he was born in the mid-30s. Janie Scott herself is not in the album. She's too young to have been included. So it's a memoir of the family, full of stories and photographs. Very interesting, but I noticed that she hadn't used any of the photographs from the album that I had worked on, even though it's a really rich source of family photographs. And I looked into it and found that the Clements had acquired the album back in 1996 from a rare book dealer in suburban Philadelphia, not far from where the family lives. And that Janie Scott had not really begun the research on this book until after her father died in 2005, and probably a couple of years after that. So I thought she had probably wasn't aware or hadn't seen this album, and certainly hadn't had access to it because it was in the Clements vault all that time. So I reached out to her through her publisher to just let her know that this album existed, and she was indeed very interested to know about it. Didn't know that it existed, and she was kind of disturbed that any family member would have sold it to a book dealer, sold a family photo album to a book dealer, and it turns out that somebody did. It was just kind of an oversight, a careless moment, and the book came to the Clements instead of staying in the family, but it's been preserved anyway. So we had an extensive back and forth for some time, and I sent her a number of just phone copies of some of the pictures in the album. And it was interesting because I, by then, knew quite a bit about her family and was able to highlight a couple of things that hadn't been on her radar. And it was good outreach for the Clements. I'm sure she'll show up one day and ask to see the album. So it was an interesting encounter.
Oh, that's so cool. I love that. So what did you learn about the family from reading the book?
Oh, I learned a lot. I mean, the book is full of anecdotes about different family members. And even though I had learned a lot about the people in the family through my couple of months of research on it, it was still just like a sketch, and her book really added color and detail and a lot of information that I hadn't known. But the book really focuses on the period after the album was put together. So the life of her father as an adult and her life. And, so it doesn't exactly cover the same period, though she does look back into the family history to tell a lot of the tales. The focus and what you learn most about really is this kind of poignant figure of her father, Robert Scott, who was a very interesting guy, quite accomplished, a successful Philadelphia lawyer. He had done a diplomatic stint with Walter Annenberg as as Annenberg's special assistant when he was ambassador to the UK. Then when he came back, he was the head of the chief executive of the Philadelphia Museum of Art for a dozen years, very successful at that. But Janney Scott had found a couple of his diaries and had learned that there was just a different person underneath the very sociable and outgoing exterior, and that he was, you know, felt very inadequate in most things and was suffered from depression. And it was pretty clear too that he had a serious drinking problem, which shortened his life considerably. So yeah, it's a very full book in terms of describing the family and particularly the father.
Interesting, thank you. Now, I know that you've been volunteering at the Clements for a long time. How did working on this photo album compare to others that you've researched and prepared finding aids for at the Clements Library?
Oh, well, you know, it for one thing, it covered a lot longer time span. I mean, most albums that I've looked at have covered maybe a decade or two. But apparently, when this album was put together, the family had a stack of early photographs that they decided to include in the album, so that you have early studio photographs of family members going back to 1860. And then the album covers a period of nearly 80 years, which is really quite unusual. Also, it was different in that it was thoroughly captioned throughout. And as Gabe mentioned, you rarely find a family photo album with captions because they simply weren't meant for public consumption. They were meant for family enjoyment, and they didn't really need to document who everyone was and where every vacation had taken place and so forth. But this one had the names of every person in every photograph, often with their middle names and their ages. So it made it a lot easier to figure out who was who. It was also different in that a lot of the people in the album were people who had public reputations. So there was information about them available on the internet and elsewhere. And for example, one of the early Scott family members had been a railroad baron who was the mentor to a young Andrew Carnegie. And another, the daughter of the woman who put the album together was a famous socialite in the Philadelphia scene and was the inspiration for the Katharine Hepburn character in the Philadelphia Story, which takes place on the main line in a large estate, much like the one this family lived in. It was also unusual in that it included other things besides photographs. There were a number of ephemeral items, like letters. For example, one family member had corresponded with a woman who was working as a nurse in a World War I Italian war hospital, which was a pretty interesting description, very grim, but and there were a number of newspaper clippings, society page clippings featuring some of the family members. There was an exhibit catalog, for example. One of the family members was an artist, a sculptor. So it was a much richer album for a lot of reasons than most of the things that I've been looking at, which are often completely anonymous. And although you can discern a lot about who the people are from just the way they interact and from their surroundings, their artifacts that you see in the pictures, you can learn a lot about them, but you may end up still not knowing who they are at all.
Right,
So this was a good opportunity.
Oh, very cool. Well, thank you. And thanks for presenting today. I am going to do just a couple of Bookworm, just a couple of announcements, and then we'll answer some more questions. So hang on, and we'll get the whole panel together answering questions. If you enjoyed today's Bookworm and it piqued your interest in the history of photography, please join us for our upcoming virtual Discover series on photography. It will be hosted in the same Zoom webinar platform, and we'll have 4 sessions with slightly different focus at each session. So that will be Wednesdays in May at 4 p.m. Eastern time, and you can register for that. In addition, if you've registered for today's Bookworm, you do not have to re-register for upcoming sessions. And if you are unable to make a session live, you will be able to get the email with the recording and the resources after the episode is aired. So you will receive those emails later today. Next week, our director, Paul Erickson, will have a conversation with an author. And then on May 8th, we'll return to the panel discussion with the theme of biographies. We have episodes planned through mid-June. We started the Bookworm as a way to engage during the stay-at-home order, and we're really overwhelmed and delighted by the number of people who are participating. So we're thinking about what we should do in the future. So I'm going to launch a poll. I'd love to get some feedback from all of you, and of course, if you'd like to email me about being a panelist or with other ideas, please do so. In addition, I know that many of you already support the Clements financially, and I thank you so much for your vote of confidence in our mission. If you would like to make a gift to the Clements, my colleagues will post a link in the chat box for you to do so, and we appreciate that. So let me go ahead and launch the poll and get our panelists back up here for a few more questions. And there's the poll, and we'll unmute everybody and see what all we have for questions. Okay, great. All right. So this is a good one. And scrapbooks are important vehicles for tracking a person's life, not only through photography, but also with ephemera collected from one's life. And so you touched on this a little bit, Les. Do university and other collections keep scrapbooks intact? So I don't know, Les, if you've interacted with some of those scrapbooks in your work, that you might be able to talk a little bit about what we do, or if I should.
Could you, what is the question again, really?
They're wondering if we keep the scrapbooks intact or if we take them apart.
Oh no, keep them intact. As someone mentioned, I can't remember whether it was Gabe or Samantha, but you know, once you separate that was Gabe, once you separate the photograph out of the context of the album, you really lose whatever chance you have of being able to figure out who that might be, or more likely how they relate to the other people in the album. So it's a kind of cumulative, your process of discovery and going through albums like these is a cumulative process, and you need all the parts to be connected up in the way that they were meant to be in order to get the best final result, which may still be kind of sketchy, but you really have to have them intact.
Right. Yes, exactly. So, and we have some amazing examples of that. And it, you know, it's certainly sometimes can be a conservation challenge for sure, but that context is really important. All right. So, we have some questions about Frederick Douglass's image and how many times he was photographed. And I think that's some of those, some of the things that are really interesting about him, if you want to touch on that, Samantha.
Oh yeah, so yes, Frederick Douglass he was the most photographed person in the 19th century. So that's something really interesting. And for him, it was, he really truly believed in taking as many photographs as possible throughout his life in order to like create this record of not only like his progression, but also just to kind of counteract that idea of you know, the projection of self. If you think about it, every time you take a photograph of yourself or sit for another photographer, that's an exchange that happens. And what's interesting about that exchange is that now you have someone who's photographing you to create this image, and then you sitting there allow them to do that. So there's trust. But also with Frederick Douglass, he wanted to put out there, he used the act of taking a photograph as also an act of activism. So for him to be photographed as many times as he has, is a way to kind of show how, like, it's a way of kind of building and elevating his own significance and self-image in context with his lectures, his speeches, and then his newspaper. So, yes.
Thank you. Thanks so much. This is probably another question for you. What is the best way to digitize a daguerreotype, and what, how do we go about that?
Okay, so yeah, the best way to digitize a daguerreotype is the settings in your Epson scanner. So the first thing you have to do is you have to clean off the surface of your scanner, place the daguerreotype into the center, and then you do a pre-scan, and then you do a focal point. So then you draw a box, with your scanner, and that sets around the face. So that focuses in on the face as the sharpest part of the image, so that the rest of it, because if you don't do that, then it'll pick a particular light spot or dark spot to focus on, and then the face blurs. So you really want to make sure that you draw the box around the face, frame it well, and then proceed to scan. When you do that, you might have some fluctuations. So the fluctuations might be like a little bit of distortion in the color, because sometimes, like with a daguerreotype, if the light hits it a certain way, it like flashes white or it flashes blue. So if you focus on the face, then that means that you get all the highlights and medium tones, and then all the shadows are very crisp. So that, if the little spot on the shoulder kind of fades out a little bit, it's not as important because you're really focused on the face.
Wow. All right. Well, thank you. It's always fun to see them scanned and see how good they look. So we appreciate you taking the time for all of those details. For anyone who's been asking questions, I also want to point out that our curator of graphics, Clayton Lewis, is answering some of those. He's typing in the answers, so people may want to check those out as well. I don't know if any of you have a thought about this, but Elizabeth is asking, what do you think about Ancestry.com as a means of sharing old photographs with family members?
I haven't used it.
I don't know. I know we sometimes can use it for research, and it sometimes helps us when we're doing research on.
I think I haven't used Ancestry for much, but my wife has, and she did a pretty thorough investigation of her family. But what she ended up doing as a way of sharing it with her other relatives was doing a book, you know, a book that where she put together the pictures and some text, and then had the book printed. A lot of services will do this for you. Apple used to do it. Shutterfly is a well-known one. And then she distributed the books through to her relatives. So that's one way that can be done.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I think it might be interesting to actually have them on Ancestry, just in case, like, you know, when people link up, especially now with the DNA testing, that a family member that maybe from a different part of the country or even in a different country might be able to see a picture of the relative. So it could be very helpful to connect in that way.
Right. Okay. So let's see. Someone is asking, and I don't know if you'll know this, Les, but I have an extensive genealogy of the Tyler family. I wonder if the Scott Montgomery album refers to the Tylers, especially Sidney Frederick Tyler of Philadelphia.
Yes, that's the same family.
Oh, that's exciting. All right,
And
Norman, I hope you're still on.
that would be interesting. Yeah, it's definitely the same family.
All right. Well, we'll have to get together and talk more about that.
Good.
Let's see. Okay, I think we already answered this one, so I'm gonna dismiss it. This is an interesting one, and I don't know if, especially maybe Gabe and Samantha in your books, if there's any thought about this, or of course, you know, what all three of you have observed. But what role did the photographer play versus the subject?
Well, obviously, I think the photographer's influence can be seen, especially studio photographers' influence can be seen in the backdrops. You only have a certain amount, probably, of backdrops you can have and props. I have a collection of cabinet cards of people with books. Sometimes they're holding them. A lot of times they're props to rest their arm on because they have to stand there a while. And often if you take out your loop and look at the titles of the books, there'll be sometimes technical manuals on photography. Those people probably did not bring us with them to pose in their photograph. It's just a prop, and I think we've talked in the past about people using books to make them look a little smarter in their photographs. And I think that's one thing where the photographer really shows their influence.
Anyone else have any thoughts? All right, let me just scroll down. I see that Clayton has answered a lot of these questions. And oh yeah, somebody does mention that she's seen terrific old photos on public family trees, and that has helped with her tracing her own family. But then other people do mention that, of course, Ancestry does charge for some items. So, okay, I just want to see if there's anything else. A good question about wondering what and I don't think we talked about this live today, but I think we had a little bit of a conversation about this when we were setting this program up. And Paul is saying that he's worried that it's ethically disturbing, the story of Janie Scott not knowing about the photo album, and wondering what the responsibility is to contact family members. And so I just want to read Clayton's question before we discuss this a little bit, answer. Clayton mentions that, of course, Les was the one who initiated contact with the family, and that we do reach out as best we can when we discover that kind of thing, but that we do have over 800 photo albums, and that the family did indeed sell the albums. So, you know, we're always happy to, the way our collections work, of course, if we do discover a family album and a family member wants to come see it, they're able to do so, which is lovely. So, and I know all of you talked a little bit about that when we were planning this program. Like Samantha, you had mentioned when you saw things at auction and, you know, sort of the conflicting feelings about it.
Oh, yes, it's like well, that's the thing. It's the conflicting feelings of it can occur, but at the same time, there's also the fact that this was sold by someone or given away to sell. So there's that idea about it. Sometimes people find albums in their collections from relatives that they don't know who the people are, or even how they're connected to the family. So, and then sometimes things just get lost, you know, estate sales are like, you know, pretty complicated about that, like, you know, because of, you know, that, of the circumstances of how they acquired the material. But be perfectly honest, I think that as long as it's like, I know that there are some people that have actually thrown away some of like albums because maybe the deceased person doesn't have any relatives. And so, and I used to work or had an associate who had her own historical society for her neighborhood. And so people would actually bring her photographs and family albums that they found in the trash on trash day to say, hey, yeah, it's like, this is really important. These are really cool photos. We don't know what to do with them. And so they gave them to her for her care. And so I think that basically, as long as the photograph is loved by somebody, you know, and appreciated by somebody, then it still retains its importance, even if we don't know who the people actually are.
Yeah, and I would add too that you know, an institution like the Clements deals with very reputable dealers, and you know, it's there's nothing in their transactions that's anything but professional. So I think there's nothing even suggesting that there was anything wrong with this kind of thing. And it's just that families are funny things. And by the time you get down to Janie Scott's generation, this family has spread out. In fact, its fortune is not anything like it used to be. This family is spread out so that there are many more, by this generation, there are many more members. And the wealth has been spread thin by now. And the house itself is I think it's still occupied, but it's not exactly in the best of shape, I don't think, anymore. So it's just a difficult situation.
I can say, as a bookseller, we buy albums, and sometimes, you know, you just have to take faith that the person that's selling the album, it's their property and it's theirs to sell. I know personally we've got many photo albums that other members of the family weren't interested in, many photographs, and many of the members of our family are just not interested in, and so we end up with them. And I think that's the same with a lot of people. They end up with a trunk full of photo albums, often without any kind of names or anything. They don't know who they are, and they want to sell them. And as long as we do our best to figure out that they are the owner of these, um, and a lot of being sure is doing this research on who the people are in the albums, and documenting the family as much as we can. We can be assured that it's, you know, ours to legally own and ours to legally sell.
Right, right. All right. Well, thank you everybody for commenting on that. I think this is an interesting one. I understand that sometimes persons who had abolitionist views did hold a famous abolitionist book, especially women in the Philadelphia area. So I think, you know, really what this is commenting on perhaps is some of what you all talked about in terms of how people present themselves in those photos and what kinds of objects they choose to be photographed with.
Oh yeah, I think that's important. I think even today, when we're snapping photographs to place to share online through social media, even though it's casual, it still has what people are still taking ownership of the image they decide to post, and even and everything else that goes along with it. And I think that abolitionists and other activists understood the power of photography and also took ownership of that as well. So yes, I think it's important.
Okay, I think Clayton has answered a lot of the more technical questions. So hopefully people are seeing those answers. And then I'm not entirely sure what this question means, but I'm going to ask it and see if any of you do. What do the panelists think of biometric usage in the future for photo collections?
I would love to see that. I don't know much about the technology, but the idea of being able to scan family members, I'm assuming, and tell us who they are and whose relation they are, that's exciting.
Yeah, in some ways it really is. So I guess we'll have to see what happens, right? All right, well, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this morning and to share your thoughts. We really appreciate it. And thank you to all the audience members out there and participants. This has been a great episode. I always learn something new. I always add to my book list, so I appreciate that. And happy Friday, everybody. Thank you so much.